Welcome to Drift and Dream Sleep Stories. Whether it's your first time here or you've somehow found your way through the quiet corners of the night, I am glad to have you here. Before we begin, I want to invite you to settle in. Maybe you are lying down, wrapped up warm. Maybe the lights are off, or maybe they are dim, just enough to let the day start to fade. Wherever you are, and however you've arrived here, let this be a small moment that belongs just to you. If you like, you can close your eyes or soften your gaze. You don't need to do anything except to listen. I am based in South Africa, and I'd love to know where you are listening from tonight. Are you halfway across the world, or just a few streets away? And what time is it for you? Are you winding down from the day, or has the stillness of night already wrapped itself around your room? Remember that you are not alone. All across the world, there are other people tuning in, hoping for a little calm, a little space to breathe, a little something gentle to fall asleep to. So if you are here with me, then that is enough. Now, tonight's story is going to get a little wild, a little legendary, and a little bit of myth and a little bit of history, all woven together in that strange space where memory becomes magic. As the story unfolds, don't worry if you drift off. That is part of the magic as well. You don't need to remember every name or follow every detail. Let the words carry you. Let them wash over you like waves from a distant sea. You see, tonight we are sailing back in time. We are sailing to a world of iron and of ice, of longships and sagas whispered across campfires under frozen stars. This is a tale about fathers and sons, about revenge and legacy, about the strange, storm-lit world of the Vikings. And at the center of it all stands one name you may already know: Ragnar Lothbrok, a king, a raider, and a legend. But tonight, our story doesn't just belong to him, it belongs to the ones who came after. They were the sons of Ragnar, each one with their own path, their own myth, their own strange thread in the great tapestry of Norse history. Some were real, some were imagined, and some, maybe, were something in between. So if you are still awake, let your breath slow down, and if you are already drifting, that's perfectly all right. You are safe here, and our sleep journey is just beginning. Settle in now and let the world around you grow quiet. Let the weight of your day simply melt gently into the blankets, into the pillows, into the softness of wherever you are, and close your eyes if they're not already drifting closed on their own. I want to take you somewhere, not just through time, but into a different kind of night, a Viking night. Not the roaring, thunderous tales of Hollywood, but the real night of the North, cold, dark, sacred. Picture it now, a coastline of jagged cliffs where waves crash like drums against ancient stone. The wind is sharp, salted with sea and wood smoke. You hear it howl across the fjord, and somewhere in the distance a single horn answers. Behind you is a village of longhouses made from timber and turf, each one glowing soft from within. Fires crackle, meat is passed, fur cloaks are pulled tighter, and in the corner of one firelit hall, a skald, a storyteller, begins to speak. He tells a tale of gods and of monsters, of blood and glory, but not as a fantasy, but as faith, because in the Viking Age, around the 9th century, myth and memory were one. These weren't just stories to entertain, they were roadmaps to the afterlife. They were how you learned to live and how to die with honor. The people of this time believed in many things. They believed in the god Odin, who traded an eye for wisdom and hung himself on the world tree for runes. In Thor, the Stormbringer, with a hammer that cracked the sky, and in Freya, the goddess of love and war, who wept tears of gold. But even more so, they believed in fate, not as something to run from, but as something you walked toward, sword in your hand and eyes open. They believed to die in battle was not tragedy, but it was transformation. For in Valhalla, they believed the worthy dead would feast forever beneath a golden roof, where the meat never ran dry, and the wounds of combat healed each dawn. So life was lived boldly, fiercely, with little fear and much pride. A Viking's worth was not measured in coin, but in how many stories were told about them when they were gone. And among all these stories, one name echoes louder than the rest. The man whose death became prophecy. The man whose children would burn cities in his name. And his name was Ragnar Lothbrok. And he did not simply live in this world, he shaped it. They say legends are shaped by the tongues that speak them, but sometimes the legend speaks back. Ragnar Lothbrok is one such name, a name so old it seems etched into stone, so loud it echoes even where history fades. But who was he? Not just the symbol, but the man himself. Tonight I want you to walk with me, slowly and softly, into the world he might have walked. We begin not in fire or battle, but in mist, because the truth of Ragnar's existence is veiled in half light. Most scholars agree that Ragnar, if he existed at all, was not a single man, but a composite of several figures. His name surfaces in the annals of St. Bertin, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, In sagas passed from father to son, each version is different. To the Saxons, he was terror itself. To the Franks, he was a scourge. To the Norse, he was a hero. But none of them could ignore him. Ragnar came from the north. That much they all agree on. From the lands of present-day Denmark, Norway or Sweden, cold shores where life was hard, but the soul was free. Some stories name his father as Sigurd Ring, a king of legend, and others call him a farmer, born of the earth, who rose by will and by war. What is clear is this: Ragnar lived in a time when men could become myths simply by daring more than the world thought was possible. He was a man of tension, a farmer who longed for war, a poet with a sword. He worked the land, and yet he dreamed of lands beyond. Not because he hated his home, but because he could feel the pull of something more. He was drawn to the sea the way some are drawn to flame, and the sea gave him ships, long dragon-prowed vessels carved with runes, guided by the stars. He sailed them farther than almost any Norseman before him, to England, Iceland, the Frankish kingdoms, and even Paris itself. To the world he became a thunderclap, but inside, Ragnar was no brute. He was a clever man. Even the sagas speak of his mind, not just of his might. He was a tactician, a man of riddles and strange silences. He loved stories. He loved ideas. He believed deeply in the god Odin, the All-Father, who traded an eye for wisdom. And just like Odin, Ragnar too sought vision, the kind that could only be found on the edge of the known world. But even the most restless men sometimes pause, and Ragnar too loved deeply. Even a man like Ragnar, who wore the sea like a second skin, had moments of stillness. And in one such moment, he met her, Lagertha. Not a queen, and not a maiden either, but she was a warrior, a shield maiden, whose blade sang louder than most men's. The tale says he met her in Norway after a brutal civil war. Ragnar had come to restore a wrong, but what he found was fire wrapped in flesh. When he approached her home, her guardian beasts consisted of a bear and a giant hound. They came snarling. Ragnar drew his spear and pierced the beast, and found Lagertha watching from the doorway, calm and unflinching. She was unlike any woman he had ever seen. She had hair braided like iron, eyes that had stared down blood and thunder, and she did not bow to him. She fought beside him in battle. She rode into war at his side. And for a time, They loved each other deeply and fiercely. But Ragnar's heart was a wandering one. Some say that he left her, others say she left him. Whatever the truth, she returned to her own path, and Ragnar moved forward. And then came Thora, a noble's daughter, kept in a high tower, guarded by a serpent that was said to be so massive it coiled around her home. Her father promised her hand to any man who could slay the beast, and Ragnar came not with rage, but with cunning. He boiled a pair of breeches in tar and rolled them in fur to shield his legs from the serpent's venom. They say he climbed the tower in the dark of night, that his blade sang through the snake like frost over water. And when he stepped over its dying body, he found Thora waiting, candle in hand, eyes wide. She became his bride, and from her he had sons, though her life was cut short, like so many things in the North. And then came the one who would change everything, Aslor. She was not born of noble men, but she was born of legend. She was the daughter of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and Brynhild the Valkyrie, raised in hiding, veiled in riddles, watched by wolves and woven into prophecy. When Ragnar first saw her, she wore only a net with no clothes, and yet no shame. He had challenged her to arrive neither clothed nor unclothed, neither hungry nor full, neither alone nor accompanied. She came wrapped in a net, biting an onion, followed by a dog, and Ragnar knew this was no ordinary woman. Aslor became his queen, and with her came not just children, but omens. She warned him of the future, and she told him, "Do not lie with me on our wedding night. Wait, or what you plant tonight will not grow straight." But Ragnar, filled with desire and certainty, ignored her, and so Ivar was born, with no bones, but he was brilliant and terrifying, a son like a god's whisper, a child who could not walk, but whose mind moved empires. By the time Ragnar's name became a whisper across distant shores, he had already done what few men dared. His sails had kissed the skies of Wessex, Northumbria, and Mercia. His ships, shallow-bottomed, fast, and cruel, had glided silently up the rivers in the dead of night, not just to pillage, but to remind the world that the sea had teeth. One of his most daring raids led him up the Seine, where he laid siege to the great city of Paris. At the time, few believed it could even be reached, but Ragnar believed differently. He approached not with fury, but with precision. His men dragged boats over land. They scaled walls with rope and with fire. And when the city refused to fall, he demanded tribute and received it. Gold, silver, and Frankish dignity traded for a night's peace. To the monks and the kings who wrote of him, he was a devil in human skin. But to his men, he was more than just a chieftain. He was a tide that could not be held back. Yet even tides recede. As the years passed, Ragnar grew older. The sea still called to him, but his body no longer answered with the same fire. And something else stirred in him, a need not just to conquer, but to know. He had seen the Saxons grow stronger. He had watched kings rise who had once cowered, and one in particular seemed to gnaw at his thoughts like a raven at bone. This was King Aela of Northumbria, a man whose lands Ragnar had once touched, a man who had sworn vengeance. Ragnar had grown restless. Perhaps he feared being forgotten. Perhaps he longed to test the edge of fate one last time. Whatever the reason, he gathered a small force, not a great army. Some say he went without the blessing of his sons. Others say that he wanted to die, that he craved a glorious end, one worthy of song. The expedition was doomed from the beginning. The Saxons met him with greater strength than he expected. His ships were scattered, his men taken, and Ragnar himself was captured. He was brought in chains before King Aela. No crown, no cloak, only quiet eyes. Aela made no effort to grant a warrior's death. No sword, no fire, but instead he chose a pit of serpents, a spectacle and a statement. And yet, as Ragnar was lowered into the pit, bare-chested, bound and bruised, he did not beg, but he spoke. He spoke of Odin. He spoke of Valhalla. He spoke of the feasts that awaited him, where fallen warriors drank mead from curved horns, and every dawn began with battle. And as the snakes wound around him, slick, silent, and waiting, Ragnar smiled, and he said, "How the little pigs will grunt when they hear how the old boar died." That was all. No scream, no cry, just prophecy. And from that moment on, the story no longer belonged to Ragnar. It belonged to his sons. For the snakes had devoured his body, but his death had become a spark, and soon the seas would burn with vengeance. And now let the fire fade just a little. Let your breath slow and your body sink deeper into stillness. You've just walked through a life that became legend. A man who stared into the mouth of death and answered with poetry. Maybe you are still awake, listening closely. Or maybe your thoughts are drifting now, like mist over a northern sea. Either way, you're exactly where you need to be, because before we speak of his sons, the little pigs who would grunt, the wolves who would rise, we must sit for just a moment in the silence that followed Ragnar's death. The world held its breath. Across the fjords, across the forests, across battle-scattered shorelines. There was no laughter that night, only the rustle of ravens in the tree, and a single whisper carried by the wind and the shadows. The whisper said, "The old boar is gone," but in the distance his sons were listening, each in their own corner of the world, and when they heard the tale of the pit, the vipers, and their father's final words, they did not weep, but they remembered, and one by one they began to move. In just a moment we'll meet them, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, each with their own path, with their own curse, and with their own echo of the fire that once lived in his eyes. But first, take one more breath, and let it be slow. Let the weight of this tale sink into you like sleep into your bones. And if your eyes are heavy, let them close. When you're ready, we'll begin again. In the age of axes and ash, when the gods were still spoken of in the present tense, and the line between myth and memory had not yet been drawn, there was a man named Bjorn Ironside. He was the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, born of Aslo, or in other versions of Thora or Lagatha. For in the way of the sagas, truth often wears many masks. But one thing that remains consistent is that Bjorn was not like Ragnar's other sons. Where some were consumed by revenge, he was consumed by the sea. And from the time he could walk, he was drawn not just to battle, but to the horizon. Bjorn was raised in a world where honor was everything, where men trained with weapons before they could even grow a beard, and where children were told stories of the god Thor and Odin the way others were told lullabies. His father, Ragnar, had already become a legend by the time Bjorn could understand speech. He was a raider, a king, a slayer of dragons, and a speaker of riddles. But Ragnar wasn't merely a warlord. He was a dreamer. He was a builder. And Bjorn, more than any of his brothers, inherited that visionary fire. While others competed for their father's attention with bravado and bloodshed, Bjorn stood apart. He was not softer and not quieter, just further away. His eyes always drifted out to sea, as if somewhere past the waves his destiny waited. Most Viking raids were short journeys, a few weeks, a few rivers, some silver and some blood. But Bjorn's ambition was boundless. In the 850s, he and another great Viking, perhaps his brother or a close companion, led a massive fleet southward, not to England, not even to Francia, but down the western coast of Europe, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the very heart of the Mediterranean Sea. This was no small feat. The ships would have faced fierce weather, unfamiliar currents, and new kinds of warfare. And yet, they made it. The Frankish chronicles, which referred to him as Berno or Pernus, describe the fear his arrival provoked. His fleet sacked Narbonne in southern France and ravished Pamplona in what is now known as Spain, and continued deeper into the waters where no Norsemen had ever sailed before. One of the most famous tales of Bjorn Ironside's life takes place in Italy. His fleet landed at a city called Luna, believing it to be Rome itself. Bjorn had long dreamed of Rome, not just as a city of wealth, but as a symbol, a city that once ruled the known world. To conquer Rome was to conquer history. When the gates wouldn't open, he tried diplomacy, but the city refused. So Bjorn did what few would have dared. He faked his death. His men approached the city gates, weeping, begging the bishop for mercy. They said, "Our great leader has died. He wishes to be buried inside your sacred walls." The clergy hesitated, but relented. A solemn procession entered. The coffin was carried to the church altar, and when the moment was right, Bjorn burst from the casket, sword in hand. The Vikings drew their weapons. The gates were opened from within, and the city fell. It wasn't Rome, but it didn't matter. The story alone would make him a legend. And back home, who could question him? Bjorn's journey didn't end there. The fleet continued. They moved along the coasts of Sicily, where Norman castles and Byzantine relics still stood. They may have fought Muslim forces in North Africa, a clash of two worlds that had rarely met. These lands were unlike anything the Vikings knew. Hot winds, blinding light, spices in the air instead of pine. Yet Bjorn adapted. He didn't just survive, he dominated. Wherever he went, the locals were unprepared for his tactics, his mobility, his ruthlessness, his willingness to wait until the perfect moment to strike. After years of conquest, Bjorn returned home, not as a raider, not as a lost son, but as a king. According to tradition, he became the first ruler of the House of Munso in Sweden, named after the island where he was said to be buried. His rule may have stretched over the upland region and perhaps into parts of Denmark. He ruled not with terror, but with the gravity of a man who had seen the world and returned alive. Bjorn's death is not described with fire or swords. There are no tales of him falling in battle, only that he returned home and ruled and faded into memory. Some say he was buried beneath a great mound on Munso Island, his ship beneath him, gold in his hands. Others say he sailed away one last time, alone into the fog, never to be seen again. In some tellings, he still sails, his ship drifting through the far edges of the northern sea, a ghost at the helm, eyes fixed forever on the horizon. But his name remained, Bjorn Ironside, a son of Ragnar, a king of Sweden, a Viking who reached beyond myth and touched the very bones of the earth. Bjorn wasn't the cruelest of Ragnar's sons. He wasn't the most mysterious or the most violent. He was the one who dreamed the farthest. He took the Viking spirit, the hunger for glory and for fate, and he stretched it across continents. He was the only son of Ragnar who left behind a dynasty that shaped real history. And he did it not by burning cities, but by going where no Norseman had dared to go. Not just a warrior, not just a king, but a map maker of legend and the sea. It still speaks his name. Some sons are born to honor their fathers, others are born to avenge them, and some are born to become something else entirely, something that should not exist, something that defies both the gods and the world they created. Ivar the Boneless was such a man, neither a hero nor a monster, but a legend made of contradictions. In the old sagas, Ivar was the son of Ragnar and Aslaug, the seeress, not just a queen, but a woman descended from prophecy, from magic, and perhaps even from the Valkyries themselves. She warned Ragnar, "Wait 3 nights after our wedding before you lie with me. If you do not, the child we conceive will be cursed." Ragnar, bold and impatient, did not wait, and so Ivar was born, with no bones in his body, or so the story goes. The truth? We simply do not know. Some say he was born with a congenital disease, possibly osteogenesis imperfecta, a condition that made his bones brittle or his limbs deformed. Others say he was perfectly whole, his nickname Boneless, perhaps referring to his serpentine movements, his flexibility, or even his impotence, as some scholars suggest. But whatever the truth may be, his condition shaped everything. While his brothers trained with axes and climbed the masts of ships, Ivar simply watched. He learned to master the one thing that no deformity could touch, his mind. From a young age, Ivar's intelligence stood apart. He could see not just the battlefield, but the mind of his enemy. He knew how fear worked, how loyalty frayed, how men fell when they thought they were safe. While his brothers rode in with swords, Ivar would wait in the shadows, simply listening and measuring, and when the time came, he would strike with terrifying precision. Many warriors were feared for their strength, but Ivar was feared for his stillness. He ruled not through rage, but through calculated cruelty. To him, violence wasn't an act of passion, but it was a language. When word reached the sons of Ragnar that their father had been murdered by King Aela of Northumbria, Ivar did not weep, he did not scream, he sat, and then he began to plan. He rallied his brothers, Ubbe, Hvitserk, Sigurd, and more, and he raised what came to be known as the Great Heathen Army. It was not a raiding party, it was an invasion force. Thousands of warriors, ships from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, it descended upon the English kingdoms like a storm, not to pillage, not to steal, but to punish. Ivar's army conquered city after city, York, East Anglia, parts of Mercia, with brutal efficiency. And when Aela was captured, Ivar didn't just execute him. He performed or ordered the most feared ritual in Norse vengeance law, the blood eagle. Aela was allegedly cut open from the back, his ribs cracked outward, his lungs pulled out like wings. Whether this is truth or just a dark legend, the message was heard across Europe. Ragnar's sons had come, and they would leave nothing untouched. But Ivar didn't just stop with vengeance. He wanted more. After the death of Aela, his brothers returned to their homelands, but Ivar stayed. He crossed the sea to Ireland, where he became known in Gaelic texts as Imar, a powerful warlord and a king. The Irish annals refer to him as King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. He fought not just for plunder, but for territory, for alliances, for power that would last longer than the fire of a raid. He may have ruled Dublin, or even extended Norse influence into Scotland and Northumbria itself. His campaigns were not just swift, they were ruthless and unpredictable. He would spare a king 1 week and burn his fortress the next. He became the boogeyman of Gaelic folklore, and yet he was respected even by those who feared him. And yet behind the throne, behind the titles and the terror, there remained the body that had never stopped hurting. Some sagas say he had to be carried on shields, that he could not walk, that his legs were useless, and yet he commanded armies that could change the fate of kingdoms. Some say he felt no pain at all, that he was born with nerves made of iron. Some say his agony made him cruel, that every time he looked at the world, he wanted it to suffer as he had. The truth lies somewhere in between. A man who was brilliant, crippled, holy, and cursed. A warrior who never swung his own axe, but who brought kings to their knees just by speaking their names. Ivar died, if we can trust the records, around the year 873 AD. Some say it was illness, others say it was a curse, that the gods had granted him too much. His grave may have been found in England, in a field where a skeleton was uncovered, massive twisted bones missing or deformed, surrounded by weapons and sacrificed animals. Or perhaps he was buried in Dublin, in the heart of the city he once ruled. Or perhaps he never died at all. Perhaps he became what the old warriors feared, a name that you could whisper before battle, a shadow in the long grass, the voice in your head that tells you to run, because Ivar the Boneless is still out there. Ivar was not beloved. He was not warm. He was a cold flame, the kind that burns slow and leaves scars long after it is gone. Among Ragnar's sons he was the mind, the will, the unbreakable force. He didn't live for glory, but he lived for control. And in that control, he created an empire that outlasted his bones. He created a legend and a ghost, a son who turned pain into power. Among Ragnar's sons, some were made of steel, others of rage, but one was made of earth, of roots, of stillness and endurance, and his name was Ubbe. And though he rarely took center stage in the great Viking tales, he may have carried more of Ragnar's soul than any of his brothers. Ubbe was likely born to Aslor, like Ivar and Sigurd, though some sources differ, just as they do with all the sons of Ragnar. In the sagas, he is never the loudest, he is never the most feared, but he is always there, loyal, steadfast, and often the one holding everything together. In a family driven by vengeance and ambition, Ubbe was the son who saw the cost of war more clearly. He trained as the others did. He learned to sail, to fight, and to raid. But beneath the axe and the shield, he carried something else, and that was his ability to listen. When Ivar called his brothers to avenge Ragnar's death, Ubbe came, not with blind rage, but with resolve. He fought beside Ivar and Hvitserk during the invasion of England, commanding parts of the great heathen army which swept through Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. The battles were brutal. Cities burned, churches fell. The army moved like a wave, cold and unstoppable. Ubbe fought at the siege of York and helped solidify Norse rule in the region. But even then, his leadership was different. Where Ivar saw only dominance, Ubbe saw the possibility of settlement, of a new life, not just for the warriors, but also for their families, for fields, homes, trade, and ultimately peace. As the Norse carved out territory in England, Ubbe began to lead beyond the sword. He negotiated with Anglo-Saxon kings. He helped lay the early groundwork for what became known as Danelaw, a swath of land where Norse law language, and life blended with the Anglo-Saxon world. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Ubbe is referred as a commander of a Viking fleet. Around 878 AD, he fought Alfred the Great, one of England's most famous kings. Ubbe is believed to have landed in Devon in southwest England, where his forces clashed with a local alderman named Odda at the Battle of Sinwit. It was a rare defeat. According to the chronicle, Ubbe was killed in the battle, but even that, like so many Viking deaths, remains uncertain. Some tales say he survived, returned north, and ruled in East Anglia. Others say he was buried near the battlefield, his banner torn, but his name intact. The truth, like the man himself, is quieter than the legends. Ubbe was not a man of spectacle. He did not seek fame through fire nor story. He left no blood eagle behind him, no blazing raid across Rome. Instead, he left footprints in the soil. He was a settler, a peacemaker, a builder of bridges between warring worlds. In modern retellings, he is often overshadowed, but in the long view of history, he represents something powerful, the pivot point between Norse rage and Norse root, the transition from raiders to residents, from wolves on the sea to farmers, craftsmen, and kings. Ubbe was not the strongest, not the most feared, not the most famous, but he was the most adaptable. He saw that the old Viking way, glory through endless war, could not last forever. He saw that survival meant knowing when to fight and when to speak. He laid the foundation for something Ragnar himself once dreamed of, a future, one where Norsemen did not have to die young, one where the children of Odin and the children of Christ might eat from the same fields. That dream would take centuries for Ubbe, but Ubbe helped to begin it. Today, few remember him as they do Ivar or Bjorn, but to those who study the age, Ubbe stands tall as the soulful son of Ragnar, a man not remembered for how he died, but for how he lived, for how he tried amid fire and blood to leave the door open for peace. And in the quiet he left behind, fields were planted, homes were built, and the fires of vengeance began to fade for a while. But not all of Ragnar's sons would rest in peace. Some carried the blood differently, not as a vision like Bjorn, not as clarity like Ubbe, not as dominion like Ivar. Some sons were left behind, in shadow, in silence, in the space between stories, and one of them was Hvitserk. No one remembers Hvitserk as the firstborn. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the most brilliant. His story is harder to trace, not because he did nothing, but because everything he did happened in the wake of someone else. He was at the battles. He was part of the army. He fought beside his brothers, but he was never the one remembered for any of it. In some sagas, he's brave. In others, he's mad. In a few, he doesn't even appear. But he was always there, always there. He followed Ivar into England. He fought with Ubbe during the great campaigns. He marched through the same mud, bled from the same cuts, and burned the same cities, but the songs were never sung for him. Some say he commanded a fleet with Ivar, that he led attacks in East Anglia, raided Mercia, and stood among the men who carved the Danelaw from English soil. Some even believe that Hvitserk may have been the same man later called Halfdan Ragnarsson, a powerful Viking king mentioned in Frankish and Anglo-Saxon sources, that he ruled parts of Northumbria, that he even claimed kingship in Dublin and fought far into Ireland and Scotland. But the truth is uncertain, because the name Hvitserk fades as the war dragged on, and what replaces it is simply pain. The sagas say that Hvitserk began to break, that he was tormented, not just by the death of his father Ragnar, but by what it cost to avenge him. One battle after another, villages turned to ash, brothers dying, and the further the army marched, the less he knew who he was following or why. Ivar grew colder, Bjorn left for distant shores, and Ubbe began to seek peace. And Hvitserk, he had no direction left. He turned to drink, to madness. One saga tells of how, in a fit of confusion, he burned an entire household alive, mistaking them for enemies. When he realized what he had done, he simply broke down, not as a warrior, but as a broken man. In one final story, Hvitserk is captured in the east, perhaps in Rus in Poland, or in the deeper forests where history thins out. His army is completely destroyed. He is offered a chance to beg, but he does not. Instead, he asks for one thing: to be burned alive atop a funeral pyre built from the bodies of his fallen warriors, not out of pride, but because in the flames he might finally escape the noise in his mind. He climbs the pile. He does not scream. They say he laughed as the fire climbed his legs, and then he was simply gone. Hvitserk left no kingdom, no dynasty, no sons. His story ends not in conquest but in smoke, and yet there's something painfully honest about him. He is the part of the saga we rarely look at. What happens to the ones who don't become legend? The ones who follow, who bleed, who burn, and are ultimately forgotten. But that too is part of the story, because not all suns rise, some simply fall. And as the fire consumed Hvitserk, the wind stilled, the brothers had scattered to kingdoms, to oceans, to memories. Some had conquered, some had faded, some had simply burned. But there was still one left, one son, who saw things the others could not. A child marked at birth, not by scars, but by symbol. His name was Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye, and when you looked into his left eye, if the light struck just right, you could see it, a coiled serpent, curled in the iris, like a secret watching, waiting, whispering. They say some are born with sight, not the kind that sees with eyes, but the kind that sees through them. Sigurd was such a child, quiet, still, strange, and in his left eye they saw something they couldn't explain, a mark, a pattern, a serpent curled like a rune. Some whispered it was a gift from the gods, others feared it was a curse, but Ragnar, he called it a sign that this son would carry more than a sword, that Sigurd would carry memory. His mother was Aslo, the Volva, the seeress, a woman descended from dragons, with runes on her tongue and fate in her womb. She had warned Ragnar not to lie with her too soon, that if he waited, the child would be born powerful and whole. But Ragnar, ever hungry for love and destiny, disobeyed. And so their children were born, touched by fate, twisted by it. Ivar without bones, Hvitserk with shadows. But Sigurd was different. He bore no wounds, only the mark, a serpent in the eye, a symbol of inner sight, wisdom folded in coils, a king's birthright hidden behind a gaze. Sigurd was not the loudest, not the strongest, but in the sagas he is said to be clever, thoughtful, measured, a prince who understood lineage, who didn't just want to fight, he wanted to build. He fought alongside his brothers in England, yes, but Sigurd's mind was always on the future, on kingship, on law, on the delicate balance of blood and rule. He didn't want to conquer everything, he wanted to hold something that lasted. After the death of Ragnar and the fall of many of his brothers, Sigurd claimed the kingdom of Sealand in what is now Denmark, a land of old gods and misty shores, of carved ships and sacred stones, and from there he began to shape a new kind of power, not one born only of bloodshed, but of inheritance. He married a woman who was the daughter of the English king Aela, the very king who had thrown Ragnar into the pit of snakes, and together they had a son, Harthacnut. From Harthacnut would come a royal line that stretched into the future, into the real kings of Denmark, Norway, and even England. The serpent in Sigurd's eye wasn't just a mark, it was a seed. Sigurd's story ends quietly, not in fire, not in madness, not on the battlefield, but in lineage. He became a father, a ruler, and a keeper of bloodlines. And while the sagas of Bjorn and Ivar are filled with clash and thunder, Sigurd's is a tale of continuity, of what survives when the war drums go silent. He was not the youngest, he was not the loudest, but he was the one who saw farthest, marked not by what he destroyed, but by what he preserved. The serpent in his eye is not just a symbol of wisdom, it is the Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail, the endless threat. Sigurd wasn't just Ragnar's son. He was the one who ensured Ragnar's bloodline would never vanish, who wove it into kingdoms, into thrones, into kings who would never know the name of their ancestor, but would feel the weight of his legacy every time they looked in the mirror and caught a glimpse of the coiled serpent in their own eye. And so the sons have passed before us, some with children, some with kingdoms, some with only silence in their wake, but all of them carried the spark of one man, Ragnar, not a god, not a saint, but a man with dirt beneath his nails, with salt in his beard, and a dream too large to be held by his time. A man who dared to believe he could shape fate, and in doing so became part of it. His story was not written in ink, but in suns who burned like torches, in lovers who became legends, in enemies who built empires just to defy him. His death was meant to end the tale, but it only began another. His name passed down not in quiet reverence, but in cries of vengeance, in bloodline and bedtime story alike. You can find Ragnar in the roots of kingdoms, in the shimmer of a distant fire, in the restless pool of the sea, and maybe, just maybe, in the part of you that still dares to dream wildly, to love deeply, to leave behind something that echoes. So now, dear dreamer, let your breath slow, let your body soften, let your thoughts wander, for the saga is told. The waves have calmed, the wind no longer carries war, but the soft hum of memory. You've walked through legend, now it is time to rest, drift, and dream.